All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's get to it. We are talking RegTech. It's exciting. Good morning. It's still a little bit of morning left. I'm Andrew Work from NextChange, the social platform connecting professionals to financial services and innovation. And we also do fintech, which means RegTech. And we have got 3 speakers here from the United States of America. They have come from New York City and from Palo Alto. To speak to you, I'm going to give a quick intro from each of them, and then we are going to get into it. Okay, gentlemen, Tim Huang, I'm going to let you kick off with a quick intro about the exciting work that you're doing.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Tim Huang. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called FiscalNote. At FiscalNote, what we do is we aggregate all of the world's laws and regulations into one singular platform and use machine learning and natural language processing to automate legal processes within about 1,300 enterprises globally today.
Okay, sounds good. John, what do you got for us?
Hello, everyone. I'm a managing director at Duff & Phelps, which we're a large independent corporate finance and valuation firm located throughout the globe, and I specialize in working with fintech companies doing valuation analytics.
Okay, sounds good. Gurjeet, you're bringing us the artificial intelligence in RegTech.
That's right. So I'm Gurjeet Singh. I'm one of the co-founders and the executive chairman at Ayasti. We are an AI-based company. We sell regulatory solutions into large financial services organizations for using AI, such as regulatory risk modeling and anti-money laundering and such.
Okay, so this is very cutting-edge stuff that we've got up on here today. RegTech, a lot of people are really interested, and there's a lot of changes coming down the pike. And we've had a bit of a discussion before this, and one of the things I got from you guys was that there are challenges in the sector. Like, a lot of people are struggling with this, but that also creates opportunities. Gurjeet, I'm going to start with you, and can you tell us a little bit about what some of those challenges are and how you're addressing them?
Yeah, absolutely. So I believe every challenge is an opportunity. 2 specific examples I can talk about. In regulatory space, one of the bigger challenges that large financial services institutions face is around regulatory risk modeling. Today, it's a process that on an average takes about 5,000 man-hours. And it's a very complicated process where you have to have people who build risk models, people who consume risk models of business, and the regulators kind of all have to agree on how to sort of agree on risk. And building these models takes a very very large amount of time. So one example of the use of AI in this is, how do you use AI to, take large complex data sets and reduce the number of variables that you can use for regulatory risk models such that the models are still understandable. That's one example. The second example is on things like anti-money laundering. Now, if you think about most large banks in the world today, a large bank like Citi or JP Morgan and HSBC employs anywhere from 6,000 to 10,000 people. And these people essentially investigate individual transactions. Now, luckily, 98% of their work does not result in a suspicious activity report, right? So most transactions are good for everybody else here.
Sure,
right?
Most of it's cool.
That's right, most of it is good. But at the same time, to keep your risk profile, you waste 98% of the effort of 6,000 people.
Yeah.
So this is another opportunity for AI where you can dramatically reduce the number of investigations you have to undertake while achieving the same or the better risk profile. So these are 2 examples of using AI in the RegTech space.
I mean, Tim, you're right in that space using, is it deep machine learning or AI in terms of attacking the RegTech issues. Tell me about what you're doing.
Yeah, so what we do at FiscalNote is we take the front end of the regulatory process. So I think that it's hard to have a conversation about RegTech without talking about what's going on politically around the world, right? You have things like Brexit, you have the rise of nationalism in multiple countries around the world. What that's doing is that's essentially fragmenting the regulatory process and the rulemaking frameworks that a lot of industries are operating within. And so within that context, you have a fragmentation of laws and regulations that all these different operations need to be a part of. And so if you're talking about a large financial institution, a large energy company, a large logistics company, they now have to operate with hundreds of different regulatory frameworks in their minds. So what we're doing is we're pulling together all those laws and regulations, all those court cases, all those different pieces of legislation, all those different statutory changes, pulling them all into one singular platform, and then using natural language processing to target each of the individual business units in a specific country to say, hey, business line manager in Indonesia or in Australia or in New Zealand or in France, here are the new requirements that you have in operating your businesses in this specific region. And we strongly believe that I think in the long term, the work that a lot of these regulatory and compliance professionals are doing, at the front of the process, monitoring these laws and regulations, mapping them to individual policies and procedures, working with specific business line managers, and actually making sure that they're compliant, all of those things will be automated in the long term.
And I mean, all this, the kind of the growth of the regulatory regime around the world is really, it's created opportunities for you guys. I mean, John, you guys are in deep, in particular in finance. Where do you see some of the biggest challenges in the world of finance and fintech, and how that relates to RegTech?
Well, I think you really break it down in financial institutions to the disrupting fintech versus the established institutions. There's a great opportunity for both of them. Cost benefit to financial institutions of being able to handle fragmented regulatory regimes, evolving changes, the obstacles they've historically had with large, established, cumbersome systems. There's a great opportunity there. I think where it gets a lot more involved is with the fintech and the startup and the disrupting new technologies that are out there, because when you're talking to the regulators, there's a newness and a familiarity with the products that have been put out there, and the ability to understand how those products, are they responsible products? Do they breach any regulations and laws? And if you're going to embed these technology solutions towards regulation, are you going to have the transparency to make sure that all of the existing framework rules are established? So we spend a lot of time talking to fintech companies, discussing what the opportunities are with regulation, but also in talking with the regulators to discuss how to understand these fintech disruptive businesses, given that they pose substantially different systemic risks than the established institutions.
Yeah, because there's the one part of RegTech where you've got companies trying to make it more efficient for traditional business to deal with regulations, but then the fintech guys, and technology being applied in other sectors is just changing everything. When you guys come along and say, "Oh, we've got a RegTech solution for you. We're going to tell you how to collect information, how to package it." How do the regulators take that? How do they like that when you guys come along and say, "Oh, we're gonna tell you how we're gonna solve your problems, regulators," right? How do they react to that? Are they like, "Whoa"?
So my experience with the regulators has been quite amazing in general. I would have expected it to be a very stodgy, institutional, federal government-based.
What, regulators? No, I couldn't imagine.
So I have to say, before I say anything else, I love regulators. If there are any regulators in the audience, I will give you a hug right now.
Any regulators in the audience?
So
need a hug? No? Okay.
So I think what I found is regulators are actually quite eager to learn about these technologies, and they are also quite eager to see change in the ecosystem as well. Right, I was in Shanghai last week talking to regulators, and one particular regulator from Singapore said, in a few years from now, maybe 5 years, maybe 10 years, hopefully, or in less, hopefully, I want to be in a situation where I don't want people to do regulatory reports anymore. I just want access to some parts of their data, so I, as a regulator, can make my own determination as to what's the risk and so on and so forth. Right. Similarly, regulators in Australia, for example, have done a very good job setting up sandboxes, where they let smaller institutions, but then also larger financial services organizations to, experiment and learn new things and, learn new things about the market. And one good example is in UK, for example, RBS has a separate entity called bluebank.io, where, they have regulatory approval to be able to, try a few new things with real customers and so on. So I think overall, I found regulators actually, they do want to innovate and they want to participate.
Okay, now those regulators, I mean, we're big on fintech, we do fintech, but I mean, it's not just fintech. I mean, how about regulators in other sectors, Tim? Because you're doing healthcare, you're doing agriculture, in addition to finance. How are those regulators reacting to, your types of solutions?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So 2 points. The first thing is I think we've been very lucky as a business to work not only with the traditional players like the UPSs, the JP Morgans, the Cargills of the world, but more of the up-and-coming players. So we started working with folks like Uber and Lyft, Zenefits, Coinbase, DJI on the technology side of things as they are coming up and trying to become a lot more compliant in the regulations, right? So as Uber has been sort of expanding into multiple different regions around the world, they've obviously seen major regulatory challenges as it pertains to ride sharing or food delivery or logistics. The same thing goes for any of the fintech companies. Any company that's operating in healthcare has tremendous requirements with respect to data privacy and the like. And so what's been interesting is that the challenges are actually the same. Whether you're a large company or a growing company or a startup. And one of the interesting trends that we've been seeing actually increasingly is that startups, particularly those that are in regulated spaces. So if you're doing online lending, or if you're building a telemedicine application, or if you're building a rideshare application, startups are increasingly making the investment upfront to speak with regulators and get their solution out there in the marketplace. But the same thing goes for on the regulatory side of things. I think regulators are now much more willing to speak with startups about the regulatory challenges and work with them around trying to figure out how to make their business models work. For us as a business, even as we think about our business, we depend on regulators and we depend on governments to publish laws and regulations and legal opinions so that we can pull all that information together. So yeah, even in our own internal operations, as we work around the world, we do sit down with regulators across the table and say, here are the requirements that we have, here are the things that we need you to do in order to make sure that our business thrives. And regulators traditionally have been actually really great at working together.
Yeah, I mean, regulators are trying to deal with startups like you guys, but I mean, John, you come from Duff & Phelps. They've been in this business for a long time. What do the regulators say about these startup guys when these guys aren't in the room? When they've got like one of the old hands in there?
I think what you're hearing from the couch, from the panel here, yeah, I mean, regulators historically are pretty, I would say, stodgy. It's years of experience and understanding all these diverse and evolved rules. But the regulating world is very hindsight 2020. It doesn't have a huge prospective view in how bank examinations, et cetera, are performed. So what RegTech offers them is tremendous in the efficiencies of not spending 75% of their time doing reconciliations, but actually setting intelligent policy. And so I think they're very much looking to embrace it. And these sandboxes you hear are looking to be set up now in the US, they're in UK, Australia, Singapore. And I think that becomes a very fertile ground for industry and regulators working together. But I think they want to embrace it. But there's going to be, as much enthusiasm as exists, some timing and an education process. I think it was Joanne Barefoot in one of those last month RegTech seminars in the States asked people to raise their hands, and I think there was probably, when they went between regulators to industry, which was about 50-50 of the population, 3 people on the regulating side understood AI.
Wow.
So it's not that they're completely unaware of technology and development, but RegTech and it's a young person's game. They're in a different awareness and readiness to embrace the technology. But I think the desire is there and the need is definitely there.
Yeah, when you talk, you bring up sandboxes, and we talk, we see a lot of regulators now, especially in the fintech space, are creating regulatory sandboxes. Are they starting to think about how they can incorporate AI and how that can feed into what they're doing in that space? Have you guys been consulted on that front in terms of how they can use AI?
Absolutely. So in particular, in the US, for example, I've spent multiple days with parts of the Fed where they basically say, hey, you're doing this new thing. We are really interested. We've heard customers really like it, and explain it to us. What do you do? How does it work? And they went pretty deep, asked questions. I've spent multiple days doing that, and they've been pretty open. Some things they are good at, other things they're not, and they're willing to learn and invest time to do it, actually.
Yeah, okay. Tim, how are you finding that? Are they coming to you and saying, we want to try something new, how can you help?
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's less about the regulator side. It's more about the enterprises. So we typically come in and they're, for a lot of our firms, the regulators are actually embedded within the firms, right? So I think those challenges are similar and they're actually related to the enterprises. The bigger challenge, of course, is getting the customization right for each of the enterprises. So for one financial institution, the way they actually organize their business lines may not be the same as how another institution does it. And so mapping policy and procedures, laws and regulations is a little bit of a challenge, but I think from that perspective, we've seen culturally that regulators and enterprises are very, very willing to work together.
Okay, but they all have to deal with the same set of regulators, but internally they've got different ways of doing things.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
John, you must deal with that all the time. Like, how are you guys finding that in terms of how you deal with the regulators? And you're in New York City. You must be talking to them on a call. I know the guys in Hong Kong and Duff and Phelps. They talk to the regulators here regularly. How about New York?
Yeah, I mean, again, for the segment of the market that I touch, it's the fintech startup or the fintech existing business in the States, because of the way U.S. regulation works, you could be choosing to do a state-by-state or an issuing bank model, which in the States means you have your originations done out of one state and export those state laws to get around having to comply by 50 states. But if you're a fintech platform, such as a lending club or a Prosper, and you issue notes,
Yep.
you're regulated by the SEC because those are deemed to be securities. If you're doing the issuing bank model, you may be following one bank like Utah, but that doesn't get you around state regulations for collections and servicing. So the conversations are always around how do you comply and how do you adopt your business and your originations, your servicing practices in order not to get tripped up, because in this space, regulation is coming to town and it's changing very quickly, because marketplace lending or peer-to-peer, as far as that part of the fintech, isn't an unregulated business. It's just a newly regulated business, and you have some different changes out there. Right now in the States, a lot of the conversation is around the OCC fintech charters, and this would allow fintechs to apply and get a national bank charter. Conversations there with the OCC surround how do you look and regulate this business, because the OCC has a very standard way of looking at lending institutions. Typically, they have taxpayers and FDIC insurance behind it, and thus the different systemic risk, because this business doesn't have that. But conversations are around how would you look and set regulatory capital, liquidity capital? How would you do the charges for a fintech startup or a fintech business when it poses different risks and they're funded either through institutionals or marketplaces or some hybrid structures?
Yeah, I mean, it gets very complex. Ladies and gentlemen, we're getting close to the end of our time here, so I'm going to wrap up by thanking Tim Wong. Forbes 30 under 30, but that was a couple of years ago, but he assures us he's still under 30. He is the CEO and founder of Fiscal Note. You can find him in New York City. You can also find John Schrader from Duff and Phelps. As you've probably figured out by now, he is their financial major domo on the regulatory front, also based in New York City. And we've got Gurjeet Singh from IASD. He's in Palo Alto. If you want him, track him down. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been your RegTech panel. I'm Andrew Work from NextChange. Thank you.